Welcome to GodPods, faith conversations from Boston College's Church in the 21st Century Center.
This is Kerry Cronin. I'm so glad to be here today for this episode of the GodPods. I am the Associate Director of the Perspectives Program at Boston College, and I am delighted to be here with my good friend. I think we've been friends for about 120 years. My good friend, Dr. Braman, who served for many years as the Director of the Perspectives Program. And we're here today to talk a little bit about finding God in art and architecture. And you're the expert in the room, Brian. So let's start just by asking you, Brian. I want to ask you just to tell us your story a little bit. You served as the director of the Perspectives Program, which for our listeners is an interdisciplinary program at BC, which has been around for decades. And Brian has served faithfully in that program, has taught and served as its director. So Brian, tell us the story of your work in Perspectives and how it led you to think about God and art and architecture.
Well, thanks, Kerry, and certainly I'm delighted to be here. And I want to thank all those involved who have taken a risk in asking me to do this. As Kerry just mentioned, I was director of our Great Books interdisciplinary program for a little over 20 years. And actually, I was fortunate enough to be hired by Father Joe Flanagan in the philosophy department to run the program. And one of the great advantages for me personally and intellectually about the program is that I had to learn to teach all four of the perspectives, which is basically philosophy, theology, art, architecture, music, sculpture, social sciences, and new scientific visions, mathematics, chemistry. So, no.
Everything about everything.
Everything about everything. And to say that I learned it, well, that's a sliding scale. One of the perspectives courses that I really fell in love with was modernism in the arts. And modernism in the arts, just for those who are interested, it's a year-long, double credit course that traces the theme of modernism as it gets reflected in art, literature, painting, sculpture, music, and architecture. And it was my work in architecture or reading Christian Norbert Schultz's Genius Loci, that I really took a shine for architecture. Because the way in which of thinking about buildings and the function of buildings or the role of buildings in our life as human beings. And that basically set me on a kind of path to read more, to think more about how important architecture is in our lives, that we really don't pay much attention to the buildings we inhabit and what kind of impact those buildings have on our own kind of spiritual and psychic life. So that's how I got to this point. And with respect to our conversation today, I'm going to talk a little bit about art, but I'm also going to focus on what I think are elements in architecture that people don't obviously think about when we think about buildings. We just seem to come and go. So, for instance, we're in Heffernan House. I mean, how many days have you come here and thought about, what does this place do to my psyche? I mean, besides I have to work, and that kills me, but nonetheless. So, yeah, that's kind of my background.
That's great. I think that's really helpful. I for our listeners, I want everyone to know that your Brian's classes are hugely popular with students. He's a Pied Piper on campus, really. And students tell me a lot. I hear from students that when they take your class, particularly in this area of architecture, students will say, I didn't know that the buildings on campus were speaking to me. And that's something that you really open up for students, that buildings talk to us, that they communicate with us, and that we communicate with our surroundings and as you say, the buildings that we inhabit. So can you say something a little bit about that? How do buildings talk?
Yeah, and I'll try and avoid a lot of the kind of pedantic nonsense that I'm prone to. And also,
Romantic nonsense.
and it was also called me a Pied Piper. It's more about leading snakes out of Ireland than it is
All right,
anything else.
St. Patrick. We'll call you St. Patrick.
I think one of the things that students are surprised by is precisely the fact that buildings communicate meanings. Buildings speak to us day in and day out, and oftentimes we're not even aware of it. And to think about meaning and values in architectural expressions is to think about the way in which a particular culture is trying to express what it considers to be important in terms of the built environment. So BC's campus, there's a large section of buildings that are in the kind of Gothic tradition. And that basically means that it's a vocabulary taken from the Middle Ages, but that vocabulary is about what does it mean to think about our pursuit of the intellectual life in conjunction with our pursuit of our spiritual life. So Gothic architecture is a way in which to talk about the relationship between faith and reason coming out of the Middle Ages. So the values then are those values that we would associate with those kinds of architectural expressions. So if you think about architectural expressions, so everyone's familiar with Cape Cod, Queen Anne style. And here at BC, there's a road that runs behind where we are called Tudor Road. That's because all the houses are Tudor style. So what does that mean? Well, it's a kind of vocabulary about a particular style that took place under the reign of Henry VIII and his progeny. And it bespeaks certain fundamental values. There's a stateliness, there's an elegance, there's an expression of wealth without being ostentatious. So when we talk about buildings and the meanings they communicate, so part of it has to be to raise a question. And Louis Kahn, the great American architect, he had a question along these lines when he would say, what does this building want to be? What does this building want to say to you? So whenever we encounter a building, we ought to ask that question. What is this thing trying to communicate to me? What are the values? I remember I was in Helsinki a number of years ago for a conference, and I always try and visit museums. And their museum was the international style, which was all concrete and glass. Now this is in the summer, so the weather was really warm and pleasant, but I went into that museum and it just as if a cold Norwegian wind blew through my soul. It was as cold as the day is long. And it had to do with the kind of architectural expression. It was very international, borderlining on brutalist. So my experience of that building and the meanings it was trying to communicate seemed to be antithetical to being a museum in that way. Is that helpful?
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. Excuse me. Yes, that's really helpful. I like that way of thinking about buildings having vocabulary that there's semantics or linguistic structures even, and I also love that idea of that a building can raise a question. That's beautiful. That is great. So I'm wondering, as you talk about the ways that art and architecture sort of raise these or articulate these meanings and values of particular times and places, is there any particular era of art that you are very much drawn to, especially in these kinds of questions?
Yeah, let me just back up a second. I think one of the important things I forgot to mention about architecture in general is that Father Flanagan, again, who was responsible for the Perspectives program when he was educating me in how to teach modernism in the arts, he always had these pithy little ways of talking about the particular kind of author we're doing. And so he said to me one day, when we were talking about architecture, he said, Martin Heidegger was the first one to discover we had feet. Now, that seems pretty obvious, right? But what he was trying to get at was the fact that Heidegger talked about dwelling on the earth and under the sky. And Christian Norberg Schultz in his work on architecture took from Heidegger this notion that buildings sit on the earth and under the sky, and those buildings ought to help us dwell in such a way as to help our lives become more fully human. Now, with respect to your question, it's not as if I have a favorite kind of period. I've been immersed recently in reading a lot about Baroque culture and Baroque architecture. And the reason for that is that there's a book by Louis Dupre, who is an emeritus at Yale now, called Passages to Modernity. And it's basically a very intellectual way of talking about what we do in Perspectives 1, from the ancients to the moderns. But he had this couple pages on Baroque culture, and he said Baroque culture was the last attempt to integrate the relationship between grace and nature. And that really struck me because I had never thought about that. I mean, I was familiar with Baroque architecture. I was familiar with it because of an acquaintance of mine used to call Baroque and Rococo basically congealed fireworks.
Concealed fireworks. That's great.
And so I didn't really kind of think a lot about it. I thought, yeah, I kind of get what he's saying. But then when Dupre wrote this, I began to start reading more about what it is he was trying to get at with a relationship between grace and nature. Because Baroque comes out of the Reformation. And again, well, this is a kind of theological podcast, so those of you familiar with one of the issues in the Reformation was indeed the split between grace and nature. And that grace was something superimposed, that human nature is antithetical to grace, those sorts of things.
Oh, sort of bifurcating.
Yeah, bifurcating, exactly. So they ended up with this kind of catchy phrase of the two-story universe. There's the supernatural universe and then the natural universe, and the two never meet. So the more I began to read about Baroque culture and then Baroque architecture, I began to see what Dupre's point was, that if you're familiar at all with particularly Baroque architecture, it does come across as gaudy, and it seems triumphalistic. But on closer examination, one of the things that really struck me is the dynamism that is inherent in the architectural expression itself. It's architecture that's on the move. And if you're in a Baroque church, there's a stronger feeling of being both within a horizontal and a vertical framework. That is, the horizontal framework of human existence and the vertical framework of God's presence. I'm reminded of T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets, where he talks about the intersection of the timeless with the time. And Baroque architecture is able to place you in that context where God and nature are operating together, even though they're distinct. So it really does give a very strong feel for the human journey as a process in God's calling us forward. And geometrically, one of the things that's important about Baroque architecture is the use of ellipses. Because circles used to be considered the most perfect geometrical form. And those who are familiar with Kepler realized that was part of the problem, because he kept trying to think about how the planets can move in a circle, but it didn't solve a particular problem until he hit upon the ellipse. So the ellipse is much more dynamic in its kind of geometrical movement. And the other thing about Baroque architecture theologically, unlike, say, Gothic, so if you've entered a Gothic church, right, you can't mistake that this is a Gothic church. I mean, because your eyes immediately want to go to the heavens. It's not necessarily narrow, but you do feel, as it were, within the context of a kind of orientation that is strictly vertical.
Yeah, you're swept up.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly. You're swept up. Whereas in Baroque ecclesial architecture, one of the important theological points was, if you go into a Baroque church, truly a Baroque church, your eyes automatically want to focus on the center altar. And the reason for that is because one of the big points of controversy during the Reformation was the real presence in the Eucharist.
Right.
So architecturally then, Baroque is an attempt to basically reinforce theologically what the church taught about Christ's real presence in the altar. And there's a lot written about the fact that the Baroque art and architecture just was a way to reinforce the kind of glory of the Roman Church. And, and I can see that, and there's probably a lot of truth in that. But I think what's missing is precisely the more deeper aspect that Baroque architecture and the culture itself is somehow, even with its grandeur and its misery, is somehow an attempt to basically say that God's presence to us is immanent as well as transcendent, and that human beings are involved in this journey and God is working through the natural order of things.
So some of these, so would you say then that those types of Baroque cathedrals, they're sort of trying to address or answer that bifurcation
Yes.
of grace
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
nature by giving us both in a dynamic relationship
Yes.
with each other.
Yeah.
Could you, for our listeners and for me, please, is there an example of a Baroque building that you might point to
Sure.
that we could go look at?
Well, you'd have to travel to Italy, which
Or
probably
we
wouldn't
could-
be a bad thing. Or
That's a good
Germany.
thing. Let's all go. Let's go now. But if we could look it up on the Google, where should we look?
Well, if you're looking on the Google, look for San Andrea Quirinale.
Okay.
It's a church by Bernini, and it was the Jesuit novitiate church.
Mm-hmm.
And it's much smaller than say the Jesu or St. Ignatius, but it really captures, I think, the geometrical form of the Baroque. So you enter and it's in an ellipsis shape.
Mm-hmm.
It's very intimate, but it's open. So there's a sense in which not only are you present to the kind of natural environment that's going on around you, but it's also God's presence in this rather open space. I mean, so in general, what I want to say also is that Baroque architecture, and we find in churches, it's very dramatic. Because human existence, as Bernard Lonergan tells us, is really a drama. And so Baroque architecture really expresses the fact that human existence is this drama that can be both tragic and joyous and wonderful, and one can struggle, but nonetheless, the architecture itself just reinforces the dramatic way of that human beings have in terms of living out their life. So San Andrea, because it's small, you can get you can get a great appreciation for it. Also, what's important about Baroque architecture in terms of churches is that it's an integration of the various art forms. So all the art, whether it's painting, frescoes, statues, are all part of the dynamic orientation to engage the senses, to engage the whole of the human person, to place you in an environment where you realize you are in touch with the holy, but it's not as if you have to go to the desert or anything like that. It's in the context of already things that are considered to be glorious about human existence. Does that make any sense?
No, yeah, that's really interesting to me. I love this point that to find what is glorious, not just about God,
Right.
but about ourselves. And I love this point.
Let me just give you one other example. Now, this is
Sure.
this is kind of the Rococo expression of Baroque, which tends, again, to be a little more elaborate, if you can.
A little more fancy.
Yeah. So there's a church called the Weisskirche, the White Church. It's in Bavaria, and it was a pilgrimage church. It's now a UNESCO heritage site. So if you look up a picture of that, what I find to be so absolutely beautiful and stunning about this church is that physically it mirrors the landscape it sits in. So the rooftop undulates in relationship to the mountains behind it. The steeple of the church in some ways peaks between two mountain peaks. It is white and yellow, and because it sits in this field, but inside the church it's brilliantly white. And the glass is all clear. There's gold everywhere. So here's a church that takes the natural surroundings that Schultz suggests that architecture ought to do and incorporates that in terms of the way in which we want to express ourselves liturgically. It's just an absolutely stunning church. So if you go online, pictures of the interior, the exterior, it really is a marvelous example, I think, of what I've been trying to suggest.
That's wonderful. Now, because we're sitting on this gorgeous campus in Newton, Massachusetts, on Boston College's campus, you've got to love the Gothic, though.
Right.
I mean...
No, that's right.
What are some of your favorite Gothic
I guess
examples?
I guess my favorite. I've been fortunate enough to have been able to see a lot of French Gothic, Chartres, Rennes, then Notre Dame before, Saint-Denis. 'Denis. 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 'De But my favorite Gothic church is the Duomo in Milan.
Oh, yes.
It's late Gothic, very late, and it's much more ornate than you would associate with other Gothic architecture. But I think the reason it's my favorite is that because it seems to have incorporated all the earlier vocabularies of Gothic architecture and incorporated in such a way as to preserve what's distinct about Gothic, but to place you in such a way as to realize that you've moved through history and you're now moving in another kind of historical moment that this Duomo represents. As a side note, all the cardinals and archbishops of Milan are buried there from the inception of Milan. They found the baptistry that St. Ambrose baptized Augustine in 385 below the church, Sant'Ecola. So it's a church that basically draws upon the whole of our Christian history, but it does so through this architectural vocabulary. Again, you just can't help but feel that you're not in the presence of some overwhelming kind of sense of God's transcendence, but you don't feel dwarfed like I've experienced in other kind of Gothic expressions.
I really like that point that you just made of to not feel sort of crushed by it, but to feel that you're participating in it.
Yeah.
Right. And that's a really interesting idea, I think, that you're putting forward, that it's our participation in dwelling in these buildings that sort of gathers up these meanings.
Yep.
And that they're historic, that you're situated in your own history, but in this long history of the vocabulary and the meanings. Yeah. That's fantastic. That's great.
And as a side note too, and this may be somewhat controversial, I suspect, but
controversial.
Well, one of the things that is problematic from my point of view about the international style of architecture is precisely it pegs itself as international. It no longer is rooted in any kind of historical account of architectural vocabulary. And it certainly isn't sensitive to kind of the cultural needs of the community. So it seems to want to be an architectural expression that stands outside of space and time. That's just a side note.
No, that was interesting. I'm sure maybe we'll get some responses on that. So are there, for our listeners, as we sort of head into wrapping this up, are there any other recommendations that you would make of artists, pieces of art, other buildings, pieces of music that you would point to that you think are particularly good at gathering up sort of religious meanings? Is there anything you would like us to go look at or listen to? Or?
Yeah, I mean, musically, Bach basically is the kind of major, the go-to guy if you're serious about Baroque and what Bach is doing musically. It really is this. You feel that his pieces just want to go on forever, and they're not going to rest at all. And so there's a dynamism to Bach's music that I think just kind of reinforces the kind of natural desire that we have to be in God, and it facilitates it that way. Of course, in terms of painters, there's a lot of really important Baroque painters, but the person I think the go-to guy.
Yeah. Person.
He's a guy.
Okay.
Caravaggio.
Oh, yes.
Because you look at his paintings and that they are quintessentially dynamic and dramatic. And it's the tension between light and dark. And it really captures, I think, the really serious aspects of the human journey. And the thing about Caravaggio as a human being is his life was all over the map too. I mean, he was accused of murder. And so if nothing else, he's an artist who at least is mired in the darker side of human existence. But his paintings always seem to reflect in a very deep way God's presence in the natural order. So I think it's the French church in Rome that has that picture of the calling of St. Matthew by Caravaggio.
You told me to go see that, and I went when I was in Rome.
And the way he uses light to kind of to tell the story of what it is he's painting is really significant. Christopher Wren, his cathedral in London, St. Paul's Cathedral, is also, I think, a must-see. There's Balthasar Neumann, who was a German architect who was responsible for, I forget the church's name, but another pilgrimage church in Germany. So those are just some
that's great.
Some names I'd throw out there.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. I think again, so for our last question, let me ask you this, because I'm hearing you say in so many words that art and architecture and music and literature can help us tell ourselves our own stories.
Oh, absolutely.
But most of us who are listening to this podcast aren't going to get to go visit those churches next weekend, but we'll be going to the churches in our own parishes. And I'm thinking of sort of my mom and I will be going to the church that she goes to. What can I look for in that small church to help me pray, to help me have this experience of finding God's transcendence and immanence and in my liturgical practices or my prayer practices? What tips would you give us?
Well, I would suggest that the churches that, I don't know what the church looks like that you go to, so I have no idea. But I think art plays such an important role in the Catholic imagination that, the statues that are in the church, if they have stained glass, paintings, because I think we have a natural orientation to beauty, and we kind of know schlock when we see it, and we know stuff that's really lovely, good. Yeah. And so I guess one of the questions is, to what degree is the art inside the church helping to bring me out of myself in a richer way? The question that I raised earlier, what does this building want to be? Does it want to be a church, or does it want to be a meeting hall that substitutes as a church? Does it want to be, some sort of other thing?
Right. Does it want to be a refuge for me? Does it want to be inspiring to me? That's interesting.
And the other thing too is that it's not unreasonable to think about going into a church, and even in art itself, and think about it as a Lectio Divina. The old spiritual practice, or still an important spiritual practice in the Roman Church, of how to read Scripture. But how does one read the churches that we're in? Our eyes, hearing, sensing, touching. To what degree are we actually engaged in the totality of our physical and spiritual being? If we go into a church and it's like being in just what do I want to say?
Right. Punching the clock.
Yeah, just punching the clock, or what I say. So we've got a building on campus here called Carney Hall. And so there was a period in the 60s when I call this the Catholic bunker look. There's nothing particularly attractive or inviting about that. And it's certainly, there are many churches that have fallen into
that are utilitarian,
right? And I understand, the cost plays a role, those sorts of things. But it seems to be absent of a kind of an imaginative way of thinking about how architecture is to support our prayer life.
Yeah.
So I don't know, is that helpful?
Yeah, that's really helpful. That's great. This has been wonderful. What a great conversation. I'm so appreciative, and I'm sure our listeners are going to love this. We'll have to have you back sometime. I would love to interview you on maybe something on poetry or music. This is fantastic. Thanks so much. And Brian and I'd like to thank the audience. We're so happy to be part of this ongoing Church in the 21st Century God podcast series. Thanks for joining us today, and get to church. Okay, thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
For more Catholic faith resources, follow us at bc.edu/C21 or via Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.